I had a lot of health problems when I was a kid. I was underweight and asthmatic and had terrible eyesight and bad hearing. I was that kid who sat in the front of the classroom and squinted at the blackboard through thick lenses. I was also that kid who had to sit on the sidelines during gym class. Lots of other kids thought I was lucky to be able to skip dodgeball, but it always looked like so much fun. I always wanted to play. As a result of this, I spent a lot of time listening to music and coloring. This was over a decade ago, long before those fancy adult coloring books, the ones with the intricate floral patterns and little fairies. I had to make do with regular, kid coloring books. Nevertheless, I would spend hours hunched over my books, tracing delicate swirls along Winnie the Pooh and Mickey Mouse in bright, vibrant colors while the soft, tiny voices of Peter, Paul, and Mary floated out of my cassette player. I was sitting at the kitchen table, coloring and listening to Puff the Magic Dragon, when I heard my mother calling my name from the next room. I turned off the music and went looking for her. It was a bright, sunny day, but I was stuck inside because of all the pollen in the air. I walked through the house, looking for my mother. I couldn't find her. I was only 8, and my mother never would have left me alone. I moved through my house, becoming more and more frantic as I searched. I couldn't find my mother anywhere. I started looking in closets and under beds. I even went up into the attic and down into the basement, both places that I usually avoided because of all the dust in the air. I pulled my t-shirt up over my nose and mouth and searched as thoroughly as I could. I opened up boxes and rifled through old clothes and Christmas ornaments, somehow convinced that my mother was hiding just beneath them. At some point, it dawned on me that my mother might be outside in the garden. I ran outside, expecting to see her bent over the tomatoes or pulling weeds. The backyard was just as empty as our house had been. I circled the house, plodding through the front and side yards slowly and methodically, checking under hedges and behind trees. I sat on the front steps, dumbfounded. I scanned the street, realizing for the first time that it was absolutely silent. Somewhere in my 8-year-old mind, I knew that I should have been hearing birds chirping and insects humming. I should have heard dogs barking, kids playing, lawnmowers buzzing, and sprinklers sprouting water onto lush green lawns. Instead, I was met with a silence so thick and heavy it felt like a blanket draped over me. To this day, I've never experienced such a perfect silence. I didn't smell anything either. Summer smells should have wafted through the air, filling my nostrils with fresh-cut grass, old barbecues, and blooming flowers. I sniffed the air intently, like a dog searching for a scent. I didn't smell anything. As I continued sniffing the air and looking around, I noticed that there weren't any animals. No chipmunks or squirrels. I even bent down to examine the grass on the lawn. It should have been literally crawling with ants, ladybugs, and worms. Normally, I hated bugs, but not seeing them terrified me. I got up and walked across the street. I knew that my neighbors would be home. The Kropatskys were an elderly couple. Mrs. Kropatski had had a stroke some years prior and was confined to a wheelchair. Mr. Kropatski hadn't modified the house for her. To this day, I'm not sure if he was too old to do it, or if he just couldn't afford to. As a result, the Kropatskys didn't use the upstairs part of the house. Mrs. Kropatski usually sat by the window in the den, which looked out at the backyard. She sat and watched the birds that flocked around the marble bird bath and feeder that Mr. Kropatski carefully maintained for her. I knew she'd be home, even if Mr. Kropatski had gone out, so I rang the doorbell. The normally gentle-sounding bing-bong was deafening, and I jumped back, clapping both hands over my ears. It echoed, bouncing down the empty street and filling the hollow air. I knew that it would take Mrs. Kropatski a while to get to the door, so I forced myself to count to 50 while I waited. I pressed my ear against the door, listening for the sharp whirring of her electric wheelchair. I was met with silence. I knocked on the door, hopping from foot to foot impatiently. Like the sound of the doorbell, the knocks rang out loud and clear, booming like gunshots in the stillness. I pressed my ear against the door, desperately hoping to hear Mrs. Kropatski's wheelchair or even her voice calling out, "I'll be right there." I looked around, taking in the silence and the stillness. I looked at the tree in the Kropatskys' front yard. The leaves weren't moving. There should have been a breeze. I took a deep breath. The air was completely and totally still. After what felt like an eternity, I turned back to the Kropatskys' door and reached for the knob. I turned it cautiously. I knew that it was wrong to just walk into someone's house without asking, but I was too scared to care. The doorknob turned easily, and I gently pushed the door open. "Hello? Mrs. Kropatski?" I called out softly, almost whispering, but my voice rang out as if I'd screamed. I winced, waiting and hoping for Mrs. Karpatsky to come rolling out of the den and scold me for not using my inside voice. Nothing happened. The echoes of my voice died away slowly, hanging in the air like invisible stains. I stepped into the house, carefully shutting the door behind me. I called out again, flinching at the sound of my voice, as I walked towards the den where Mrs. Karpatsky should have been sitting in her wheelchair. The den was a small room with large picture windows that looked out over the backyard. The backyard had once been neat and well kept, but it was now weedy and overgrown. The only spots that showed any sign that someone had been there were the bird bath and bird feeder. The den was empty. I don't mean that all the furniture was missing or anything like that. All the furniture, knickknacks, and framed pictures of family members were there. Mrs. Karpatsky was not. Her wheelchair stood by the window, empty. Seeing it made the color drain from my face. I turned and ran out of the house, screaming. Normally the sound of a child screaming in terror would have made everyone come rushing out of their houses to investigate. Nothing happened. The street was completely and totally empty except for me. I went from house to house, knocking on doors, ringing doorbells, and calling out for help. In a fit of terror and frustration, I actually threw a rock through a car window, triggering an alarm that blared and wailed, permanently shattering the silence. I didn't encounter a single soul. No one was outside. I was outside for what felt like hours, but the sun hadn't changed or shifted position in the sky. I'd been outside for so long that my pale skin should have been tanned or maybe even sunburned, but I was still pasty as ever. I looked up at the sky and noticed that the clouds weren't moving. They hung heavily, like gobs of cotton that had been glued firmly in place. I don't know how long it lasted. At some point, I was too tired and hungry to keep looking for people. I trudged back to my house and ate an entire packet of Chips Ahoy cookies. Normally, it would have made me sick, but instead of throwing up, I curled up on the couch and cried myself to sleep. I don't know how long I was asleep for, but it was getting dark when I woke up. I sat up and looked around. The car alarm was no longer shrieking, but the oppressive silence had not returned. Instead, I could hear the sound of crickets chirping. Somewhere, a dog was barking, and I could hear the wind rustling through the trees. "Hey there, sleepyhead." I nearly jumped out of my skin when I heard my mother's voice. She was standing over me, gently rubbing my shoulder and smiling. "Dinner will be ready soon." I ran out of the living room and into the kitchen. Upon opening the door, my nostrils were filled with the thick, meaty aroma of sloppy joes. My father was sitting at the kitchen table, casually flipping through the newspaper. "Are you feeling okay?" he asked. "You were asleep for such a long time." He pressed his large, cool hand against my forehead and frowned. "You don't feel warm." I tried telling my parents what had happened. They told me that it had just been a nightmare. They assured me that the Karpatskys were both at home and that no car windows had been smashed. My mother had been gardening for most of the day. She had come in to find me asleep on the couch. She had assumed that I hadn't been feeling well, and she had just let me sleep. I'd apparently been asleep for hours. When I told her that I'd eaten an entire packet of cookies, she humored me by checking first the cupboard, then the trash. The cookies were still in the cupboard, wrapped in the shiny blue and white plastic that I had tossed into the trash when I was done. The little plastic trash can contained the usual kitchen detritus, but the Chips Ahoy wrapper was absent. I let my parents convince me that it was all just a dream, mostly because the alternative was too scary for my 8-year-old brain to comprehend. For decades, I'd been convinced that finding the world completely and totally empty was just a bizarre dream. Now, I'm not so sure. I spent most of yesterday retiling the bathroom while my daughter played in the yard with our dog. After a few hours, I came downstairs for a glass of lemonade and found my daughter and the dog both asleep in front of the TV. I had thought that the whole thing was cute until my daughter woke up and threw her arms around me in the tightest little bear hug I've ever felt. "What's wrong, sweetie?" I asked. I could feel her trembling. "Everyone was gone," she sobbed. "I came in to use the bathroom, and when I went back out, everyone was just gone."